Hello and welcome to the fourth and final program of Consciousness Central 2022. I'm your host, Nick Day. We've been on hiatus for a couple of years because of the pandemic, and finally we're back with a new series of programs featuring conversations with some of the leading minds in the field of consciousness research. And in this final program, we talk to Sue Blackmore about the fallout from her ongoing debate with Deepak Chopra. We welcome back KELVIN MCQUEEN to hear about the latest in the philosophy of quantum consciousness. And first-timer at TSC, Emily TROSCIANKO, shares her impressions of the conference. Finally, our good friend and philosopher David Chalmers tells us why the metaverse and virtual reality may be just as real as reality itself. TSC concludes traditionally with the Poetry Slam and the Zombie Blues, and we will close our 2022 series with a few highlights from that evening. All this and more in this final edition of Consciousness Central 2022. And I'd like to welcome back to Consciousness Central, a mainstay of the Science of Consciousness conference, back in the days when it was still toward a Science of Consciousness.
Absolutely, yeah.
Susan Blackmore, welcome. Thank you so much, Sue, for coming back. Susan is a visiting professor at the University of Plymouth, and she's also co-author of the definitive textbook on consciousness, An Introduction, with her wonderful daughter, Emily TROSCIANKO, with whom we have already spoken. So, Sue, welcome. Thank you so much for coming back again.
Again, yeah, I've done this before, Nick.
Just a few times.
Yeah.
But we always have such a good time. So, I'm just glad you're here.
Thank you.
So, first question, how has your week been at TSC this time, after this hiatus of misery with the pandemic?
Yeah, and quite a few years since I haven't been as well. It's
That's
been
right.
quite a gap.
Yeah.
Oh, lovely. I mean, it's wonderful to be back in Tucson. But it's kind of mixed. I guess it's Stuart Hameroff in charge. You get this weird mixture. We've got an awful lot of quantum stuff, but then astrobiology. Is that really relevant to consciousness? Well, I enjoyed that. Yeah, it probably is. And there's been other things that I've looked at and thought, oh, what's that doing here? But I guess that's always been part of the fun. It is such. I mean, in a way, consciousness is everything.
Exactly. Yep.
And then, of course, there's Deepak being here, which has been interesting for me. So it's been a great week.
So that was an interesting moment in the conference. So 10 years ago, Sue and Deepak Chopra had somewhat of a misunderstanding, should we say?
No,
an interesting moment.
All right, we had an interesting moment. Yeah, that'll do.
There was a moment of, shall we say, conflict, which took a lot of people by surprise. And since then, it was at the time.
Were you there at the 10 years ago?
I was there.
My answer is one that Deepak abhors. It's not exactly an answer. My approach is to say that consciousness is an illusion. Now, what do I mean by illusion? Just the ordinary dictionary sense of illusion. It's not what it seems to be. I think that the hard problem, last night Deepak said the hard problem is insoluble, and I agree with you. It arises because of the illusion, I think. It arises because we think about consciousness in the wrong way.
Daniel Dennett's book, Consciousness Explained, should be actually called Consciousness Explained Away. Because that's what he does. And that's what Susan did right now. She explained it away by saying it's an illusion. And yet, she's a conscious being who's giving a lecture. Who was giving the lecture?
But you interpret it as the power of consciousness to affect these things. I interpret it as part of a body doing certain things, behaving in a different way. A whole integrated mind-body machine is changing, and doing meditation changes thoughts, which are just part of what's going on in here. Doing meditation has profound effects, but it's nothing to do with the power of something called consciousness. That, again, is leaping out, having a dualist view in which there's consciousness,
No,
subjectivity.
you're a materialist
affecting.
monist.
No,
I'm a consciousness monist.
No, I'm a neutral monist. I'm a neutral monist.
Mutual?
Neutral.
Neutral.
Neutral monist. I do not think that either is primary. Somehow we've got
Who's
to get
the I?
Right.
And it made the front page of the Arizona Daily Star.
I'd forgotten that.
Which, as I said, it must have been a slow day because usually disagreements at conferences would make it page 11. But you made the front page. So what happened with your conversation with Deepak this time?
Well, it was not what I had expected. There were two things in my mind. One was to have a really nice conversation. He and I get on really well on a personal level. And the night before we'd had a lovely conversation, and I hoped we could do the same thing with an audience. And I wanted to and did explain that he and I have a lot in common in terms of our lifelong meditation practice. But that in terms of consciousness, we completely disagree. He thinks it's all consciousness. I don't know what it is. So I wanted to do that. I also wanted to tackle him on what he had said 10 years ago, which was that he's following the Vedanta way, which in the first 25 years of your life you do this, you grow up, and the next so on. And after 75, you give it all up and go away to seek enlightenment. And I wanted to find out whether he's doing that because he's 75, 10 years on. So this was in my mind, and I started to say a little bit at the beginning about how we agreed. And instantly, Stuart, who was meant to be moderating, well, sort of moderating, jumped in and started arguing with me about what I was saying about out-of-body experience. Hang on, you're the chair, you know. Okay. And then Deepak did his thing, and then we began talking, and then both of them just kept interrupting. And it was a real struggle to keep in my mind what he said, and Deepak does tend to he's a master of deflection. So he would say all these different things. So I'm concentrating so hard, I sort of realized there's this roaring noise coming from the audience. I had no idea whether they were shouting at me or what was happening. It was really only later I discovered that I don't know how many people, lots and lots of people were shouting, let her speak, give her a chance, shut up you two. The definition of an illusion, because I got confused about this, look up in the dictionary. An illusion is something that it's not what it seems to be. Now, in many cases, perhaps all of us, we begin by being dualists. Young children are dualists very early on. They have an idea that this is my mind and I'm controlling my body.
Well, excuse me, it's okay to say there are illusions in consciousness, but it's not the same as saying that consciousness is an illusion. Are you saying that all of...
I love you, audience. You're wonderful. I'll try and be brief. I only say that consciousness is an illusion when we live with the idea that I am inside, looking out through my eyes at the world.
She's sticking up for you. Okay, Sue, you have the floor.
Say that again. What did? Okay.
Let her talk. No, we're not done.
I don't even know what everyone's whooping about and what this lady just said.
It was a shame because, you know, their aggression, rudeness meant we couldn't have the kind of conversation that Deepak and I have had and can have. So it was kind of mayhem.
Yeah, it was a bit of a lost opportunity. Really.
It was a lost opportunity,
yeah.
and in a way, you know, I'm glad I did it. I think I learned quite a lot about them, really. I was sorry because a lot of people in the audience were quite upset. Lots of people walked out because they couldn't stand it. And so it was a great shame from that point of view.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, not our finest hour, or their finest hour, shall we say.
No, but very, very interesting.
A little dent in the brand, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. Okay, what would be your highlights this week? Things, the takeaways that somehow were exciting and opened up perhaps something you hadn't considered before?
Oh, two completely different things come to mind. One is Paul Davies on time, and he says time is an illusion, and that's something you get in spiritual traditions a lot. And he explained why he thinks it's an illusion. But what really struck me was he talked about mutual information, which is if you have two systems, if there's more mutual information in common, then you don't need to do so much to, if you've got one, you can predict the other. The whole has less information. But he looked at that in terms of self. So there's a lot of mutual information between me now and me an hour ago or last week or whatever. There is no continuous person, which I would certainly say from meditation practice and from neuroscience. You know, there isn't somebody in there running the show. But by talking about this similarity, if you like, between selves at different times, he showed how the illusion of self, the continuity of self, comes about. And I thought that would really have set me thinking about mutual information. A completely different thing that comes to mind was last night, the session on ayahuasca. And I was amazed. It was the head of the Santa Daime church, which legally uses ayahuasca ceremonies in their worship. And I was thrilled to meet him. He had such a presence about him. I mean, I was luckily sitting in the front row and close to him, and it was wonderful. And I have had myself ayahuasca 8 times. I certainly hope to have it again. Everything he said rang true. But he also pushed things on, and I asked him about intention, which is very important in ayahuasca. And he talked about intuition, because I never know what you're supposed to do. You know, what is meant to be my intention? Well, no wonder I'm a bit floundering, because I haven't got the right intuition. It hasn't come. So I'm very happy now to be able to wait and feel if intuitions do come about the intention. And working with a very difficult drug like ayahuasca, and hearing him talk about it that way, I found very helpful.
There was quite a big section on psychedelics, as well as the ayahuasca, and also neuroscience. And I think it seems as if, because we've both been following this whole consciousness field for quite a long time, it feels as if, you know, psychedelics have really come into their own in the past few years. And people like Robin Carhart-Harris have been very much part of that, because they seem to be, it's a very clear line that he's steering. He's balancing a lot of things. It's a difficult thing to do, to be, you know, to work in that field, because of all the sort of historical baggage that it brings with it. And it feels, I don't know if you agree with this, but it feels to me as if finally the 60s baggage is kind of being left behind. Yeah. And we were entering perhaps a Renaissance period where there's so much research going on. This seems to be incredibly positive to me. I don't know how you feel about it.
Oh, absolutely, totally positive. I wasn't quite doing it in the 60s, but I was in the 70s.
Yeah, exactly.
And yes, it's wonderful. But it's sad as well to think that prohibition has stamped on these amazing drugs as though they were like cocaine or, you know, heroin or something, and they're so different. And now at last we can, you know, people are doing research on end of life, how it helps, and, you know, all sorts of wonderful work. What I would have liked more of in that is a connection between the neuroscience that we heard, which was really great, where they're getting to begin to understand which psychedelics affect which part of the brain and so on, and the experiences themselves. Yeah. So I think there's still a kind of fear hanging over from the 60s, if you're right about that. We don't want to quite talk about, wow, you know, I would.
That's a very good point.
We didn't get that, because we've got to be sensible and scientific, and in the end, we need both, because we need to know when you have this particular kind of experience with psychedelics, dissolution of self, or just amazement, or awe and wonder, or the increases in complexity and the things that you look at. I mean, all these psychedelic type effects, how they relate, and I want to hear about them as well. So I think it will mature.
Okay, with that, I would like to say thank you so much, Sue, for coming today. It's a pleasure always to see you, and thank you for bringing Emily along, and we get to meet her, and we'll just see you next time, I hope. A pleasure as always. Oh, I don't know. I always say I'm never coming again. I know you do. I know. Well, maybe we'll see you in Sicily, because who wouldn't want to go to Sicily? True. I don't know. True. So we'll see. Anyway, thanks again, Sue. Thank you. So I'd like to welcome back to Consciousness Central Kelvin McQueen. Kelvin was with us a few years ago, I think around about 2016, so it's been a few years. And he is an assistant professor of philosophy, soon to become an associate professor of philosophy at Chapman University in Orange County in California. Last time we spoke to Kelvin, he was in Israel at Tel Aviv. His area of interest is science, neuroscience, and quantum physics. Welcome, Kelvin. Thank you for coming back. So I'm going to just launch into a very generalized sounding question. From the last time we spoke to you to today, what's been going on? Where have you been? What are you doing? What's it all about?
I moved from Israel to California.
Okay.
And I've been continuing working with my former PhD advisor, David Chalmers. When we talked 6 years ago, it was about our joint project, and it was in its infancy, it was very new. We've more or less finished it, and it's going to be published in August in a book called Consciousness and Quantum Mechanics. So I've been working a lot on developing that, and that's a combination of quantum physics and neuroscience. I've also been looking at just neuroscience by itself, quantum physics by itself. So.
Okay. Awesome. So because this is the Science of Consciousness conference, I guess we'll kind of shine our focus in that direction. So when you're thinking about the relationship between quantum physics and consciousness, straight away it makes me think of Orko R and Stuart Hammer from Roger Penrose, because obviously they have got a quantum consciousness theory. Are there others that are using quantum physics?
There is.
Yeah. And so let's talk about them for a second, because we've talked a lot about Stuart and Roger, but let's hear what other people are doing and their approach and how it compares.
Yeah, so we're deriving our approach from an old idea. It goes all the way back to John von Neumann, but it was particularly associated with the physicist Eugene Wigner, a paper he wrote in the 1960s. It's based in the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. This is the idea that the Schrödinger equation, the main dynamics of this theory, tells us that when you perform a measurement, you don't get an outcome, you instead get a quantum superposition of contradictory outcomes. But we don't see that. So the Schrödinger equation seems incomplete. Textbook quantum mechanics tells us, well, when there's a measurement, the primary equation of motion, the Schrödinger equation, kind of stops telling us how the system evolves, and what you instead get is a random collapse to one of those outcomes of the measurement. And this is the measurement problem, because what is measurement? What counts as a measurer? We've got the fundamental law of nature sort of changing, going from the Schrödinger equation to this collapse idea based on what we do, or what seems to be what we do. So that's the measurement problem, and that's been with us since the beginning of quantum mechanics, and it's still entirely unclear how to solve it. But one proposal, and this goes back to Eugene Wigner, which is to say, well, here's what we perhaps could mean by measurement: conscious observation. And so that was his suggestion, but the main complaint was, well, how does that help? The original problem was this notion of measurement is too vague to be used to formulate a fundamental physical theory. Now Wigner just replaces measurement with consciousness. Well, how is that an improvement? Isn't that just as vague? And certainly in the 60s, that's a reasonable objection. But things are different now, because in neuroscience we've got mathematical theories of consciousness. We've got ways of describing consciousness in the language of mathematics. In particular, the so-called integrated information theory of consciousness gives a mathematical description of consciousness. And it turns out more recent developments have been able to translate integrated information theory into the language of quantum physics. It's called quantum integrated information theory. And so what we do is we say, okay, we're going to see if this consciousness causes collapse idea can be made precise with help from quantum integrated information theory. So we take the mathematical description from quantum integrated information theory and sort of plug that in for the word consciousness. And so instead of measurement causing collapse or consciousness causing collapse, it would be quantum integrated information causing collapse. So it's a way of trying to make precise this idea of consciousness causing collapse, and what interests me about it is not that I necessarily think it's true. I have no idea what the true theory of consciousness is. I have no idea what the true solution to the measurement problem is. But this at least yields experimental predictions, at least if we can get really precise on it. And the major prediction is the breakdown of universal quantum computing. So you can test this theory in quantum computers.
We've been talking to people about the potential to create a quantum gravity computer.
Okay.
And the quantum gravity computer, in theory, then could also time with the ORCO-RR idea that reduction, collapse of the wave function is itself, that is a moment of conscious awareness somehow. Now, all these, the thing is with all these theories, they always feel like there's a little bit of a leap between a lot of computation going on here and suddenly awareness. And it seems that because awareness is so purely subjective, it's so hard to sort of break it down. And, you know, as Dave says himself, you know, it's hard to get behind consciousness. It feels what could be behind it. But here we are. Something is. You know, are we tapping into some sort of grand field of consciousness that is localized? And then, you know, that's a good question. Let's do that. Are we tapping into a grand field of conscious awareness in some sort of potential state? And is that the fundamental basis of awareness when it reaches phi according to your model? Am I kind of characterizing that in approximately the right way?
I think it's a good question, especially when we want to compare our model that uses IIT with collapse and the ORCO-R model that doesn't use anything like IIT, but uses collapse, as you say, gravity, and then tries to derive consciousness from that somehow. So where does consciousness come in this particular theory? Well, it comes in through integrated information theory. That's the theory of consciousness we presuppose that we then combine with the collapse of the wave function. So where does consciousness come in integrated information theory? I mean, part of it was the perturbation complexity index stuff. You've got some empirical connection, but intuitively not very satisfying because you look at the mathematics of IIT, you reflect introspectively on your consciousness, they seem to have nothing in common, which I think was maybe sort of...
I think that's what I was getting at.
What you're getting at,
a little bit of a clumsy approach, but yes, you're about right there.
So here's a way of trying to motivate the intuition behind integrated information theory. So if we reflect on like our current experience, visual experience, there's a lot. I mean, we're in this beautiful city of Tucson, we can see out the window, there's all this detail. And just think for a moment about how big the book would be if you try to write down every piece of information that's just in your current visual field. The book would be large. That's a lot of information. It's a lot of information packed into a single representation, your current visual representation in your visual field. So that's one thing that seems to make consciousness kind of special. It's capable of just, I mean, it seems to be relevant to representations that are just packed with information. And then there's this other intuition that the information within a given conscious experience seems really, how do you put it, continuous, unified, integrated. There seems to be a sense that the whole is greater than the parts, or at the very least, it's difficult to see how you can understand a given conscious experience as just the sum of its parts. It just seems very continuous and integrated. So that's the sort of fundamental idea. Introspectively, we arguably see our conscious experiences as integrated information. And that's before we've said any mathematics or talked about any of these networks and feedback connectivity or anything like that, or even looked in the brain. Just by pure introspection, that's a way of getting the intuition of integrated information going. And then if you think that you have a strong epistemic access to your consciousness through introspection, that is, you are, to some extent, by introspection, revealing at least some of the nature of consciousness, what it really fundamentally is. The hypothesis of IIT is, well, that's it. That's the sort of truth of the matter. When you introspect and you notice this integrated information, that's the sort of truth of the matter. Now add to that, there's a close connection between consciousness and the brain. Okay, next step, now go look in the brain. Look for integrated information. Well, what we see in the brain is networks, neural networks. That seems to be pretty relevant to consciousness. Okay, define up a notion of integrated information that applies to networks. That's what they did, that's where they started, and then after doing that, going back to this perturbation complexity index, which the connection, I should say, is controversial, I don't want to oversell that, but they started from phenomenology, they started from introspection. Here's a key idea, integrated information. Okay, now there must be something about that within the brain. Okay, let's define up a notion of integrated information that applies to the brain, or at least to networks, a simplification of what's going on in the brain. And now let's implement it, let's try and measure it. And then they had some interesting success with this. So I hope that answers your question. That's sort of the way in which consciousness comes in. They do start with our introspective access to consciousness.
Okay, Kelvin, thank you very much for talking to us today. It's always interesting to check in and see what's going on in the world of the philosophy of quantum physics as it relates to consciousness. And yeah, we'll just keep marching on till we get there.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. So for my next guest, I'd like to welcome to Consciousness Central, Emily TROSCIANKO. Emily is at TSC for the first time. She is with TORCH, which stands for the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities. She is a research associate there. Emily, welcome.
Thanks, it's lovely to be here.
Okay, good. So, so you come to TSC, the Science of Consciousness Conference. This is your first time here, and I gather this is part of kind of an emerging interest in the field of consciousness science. Am I right in saying that?
Emerging interest, yeah.
Yes.
It's been a bit of a crash course in the last 6 years, I suppose.
Okay.
My mother, Sue Blackmore, was trying to decide whether she could face writing a third edition of her textbook, Consciousness and Introduction, and we were chatting about it, and neither of us is entirely sure who had the idea that we might collaborate. I might help, but one of us did, and that's what ended up happening. So although my background is in a rather different area, my work is in cognitive literary studies, so doing experiments on how readers respond to fictional texts. There was already some overlap. I was already citing Sue a bit, I was citing Dennett, I was thinking about experience in the context of what kinds of texts elicit what kinds of experiences. So it wasn't a huge leap over to thinking more centrally about consciousness, but it was, I mean, it's a terrifying topic to have to get an overview of yourself, and then doubly terrifying to have to convey a comprehensible overview to undergraduates. So, that was our challenge over the following few years, and yeah, I learned a huge amount.
Okay, great. So, so you're here. We're now at the end of the conference. We're on the last day today. And what has your response, your reaction been to some of the things you've encountered here? How's it been?
Some of my impressions have been about the sort of tension, I suppose, between what's happening empirically and what the big picture theoretically is. I've been quite struck, even in sessions that are, for example, called things like theories of consciousness, how low level a lot of it is, and how the links aren't always being made between what's really at stake here versus, okay, what are the details of this experimental paradigm or these experimental results. And I think that is always a challenge, and it's something we came up against over and over in the writing of the textbook, is how you keep tying it together and really asking the question of, okay, if we are finding these things in this particular experiment, where is that taking us? It's been really encouraging to hear about the kind of developments in adversarial collaboration and the attempt to really formalize what it means to generate hypotheses in support of a theory or even meta theory, and to really hold yourself to that as an experimenter, and not be able to fudge it afterwards to say that, well, it was in support of IIT all along, wasn't it? So I think that seems really exciting to me, and I think the field is so fragmented still, and there's such a lot of energy going into doing lots of very, very clever and often very expensive experiments, but not necessarily always with that global overview being returned to. So I hope that there'll be even more of that as these, particularly as these adversarial ideas come into maturity.
Okay. Where would you find yourself on the sort of the spectrum of the hard problem? How does that land for you? It would perhaps just from an intuitive point of view.
The hard problem, as Chalmers stated, it seems insoluble to me. My instinctive sympathies are these days, I guess, towards illusionism, so pushing back or shifting the problem from how do we solve the hard problem to why do we think there is one. It seems more likely to me that we might get somewhere, at least that must be part of the approach that we need to be taking seriously what the structures are of the intuitions that are challengeable and that lead us to have preferences for certain theoretical or, again, meta-theoretical perspectives, because it's all, none of it's happening in a vacuum, and the details of my embodiment, the details of what drugs I have or haven't taken, and what cognitive, spiritual, whatever other practices I've been engaging in, all of that is shifting all the time. What theories are likely to seem plausible to me? So, yeah, I think at least tying that in somewhere with all the other exciting stuff that's going on would be great.
I don't know, sometimes you can wake up and be a materialist, and the next day you wake up, you're an idealist, and you kind of, well, yesterday I was a materialist, what happened? I don't know, it's a little bit of a dance. It is fun though, I think it's kind of very compelling. It goes to something so fundamental to our being, even existing in the first place. Yeah. Cool. So would you say that this propels you to further interest into the future? Having come here and being exposed to the whole range of different voices, and having the critiques that you have, presumably also positive things that are coming out of it.
Yeah, it's been brilliant just learning about some of the cool stuff that's happening. Some of my interests are, a lot of my work on textual responses is about therapeutic potential, and seeing how the psychedelic field is flourishing in that respect has been really exciting. Sue and I have been here partly in order to get a bit of the lie of the land when it comes to the 4th edition of the book, and trying to work out what are the most important trends here, where is the most movement happening, and yeah, this has been a great place for starting to try to answer that question.
Excellent. So, well, hopefully we'll see you back here at least in 2 years' time. Emily TROSCIANKO, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much,
Thanks a lot. Nick. So I'd like to welcome back to Consciousness Central, the mainstay of the Science of Consciousness Conference, and indeed Consciousness Central, David Chalmers. Welcome back, Dave.
Hey, great to be here.
Dave, of course, is a professor of philosophy at NYU, and he is currently releasing his new book, which is called Reality Plus. This is a shameless plug for Dave's book because he's a good friend of ours, and we're happy to do this. But so, Dave, this is Virtual Worlds and the Problems of Philosophy. What are the problems of philosophy, and how do they relate to virtual worlds?
The problems of philosophy are, what is reality? How can we know about it? What is consciousness? How can you live a good life? Do we have free will? How should we design an ideal society? How does science work? I don't know, is that enough problems?
There are plenty of
yeah,
there.
okay.
That's a good long list. Okay.
And I think thinking about virtual worlds can illuminate all of these questions. I mean, virtual worlds are like artificial realities. Philosophy is all about reality, but we just got one reality here, the normal one, the original one. But with virtual realities, we get to construct all these new realities, and you can just pose so many questions. So here's one. Could we ourselves be living in a virtual world right now? Could all this be a simulation? This is actually an echo of one of the great philosophical questions asked by René Descartes. How do we know that any of this is real? Could all this just be, could all this be a dream? Could it be the product of an evil demon just putting together a massive simulation? But these days we ask, could all this be a virtual reality? And I think that's actually a live possibility. The book actually mostly tries to argue that virtual reality should not be thought of as fake or fictional or second-class realities, as is very common. Rather, virtual realities are genuine realities. So yes, we could be in a virtual reality. Yes, we could be in a simulation. We'll also be making many virtual worlds ourselves in the years to come. But none of these should be thought of as fake or fictional. This is actually going to be a genuine form of reality in which you can live a meaningful life. So the book is basically riffing on that idea in the context of a million different virtual worlds and a million different philosophical problems.
Okay, so that said, the book is entitled Reality Plus. So you're inferring with your title that yes, this could all be real, but it's plus. So what's the plus part?
Yeah, I think of the plus as, okay, well we normally think of reality as involving this reality, our physical reality. But actually, there could be so much more to it. There's all the virtual realities that we will create. For example, the coming metaverse, as some people call it. All these virtual worlds will be part of reality too. Furthermore, if we're living in a simulation, then there may be a reality that created us, other realities that it created, further realities up the ladder of simulations within simulations. There may be a whole cosmos of different realities. So that, I guess, is what I think of as reality plus. Physical reality, this metaverse of the virtual worlds that we'll create, and maybe a multiverse of alternate realities which are out there, all created alongside us.
So do we carry our problems of philosophy forward into these other realities? Do they still exist, or are they somehow resolved? Or
I think, yeah, the problems of philosophy don't go away, but virtual reality is like a tool which we can use to raise some of these questions and to address some of them. Like, what is the nature of reality? Well, if we're in a simulation, that'll shed light on that. What can we know about reality? Well, that requires, can we know whether or not we're in a virtual reality? How can we lead a good life? Well, here's a question. Can you lead a good life or a meaningful life in a virtual world? Or is there some reason why not? So I guess I find that virtual worlds provide these amazing thought experiments just for raising many of the deep questions of philosophy. It doesn't actually solve them. That device doesn't solve them on its own, but it provides a tool we can use to make progress.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and how would that start to touch our questions here at the Science of Consciousness conference, for example, the hard problem?
I don't know if thinking about virtual worlds suddenly solves the hard problem, but let's say it provides a new way of thinking about some of the central problems of consciousness. One of the questions that comes up, for example, in thinking about simulation is, would a simulation of all of us, say, would a simulation of me be conscious, like me? Some people will say, no, a simulation can't be conscious. That's to say that basically a simulation would be like a philosophical zombie. Maybe it would act like I act and do like I do, in the words of the zombie blues, but it wouldn't be conscious at all. There'd be nothing going on inside. Whereas my view is a simulation of us can, in principle, be conscious, and there's no obstacle to simulations being conscious. Another issue which comes up is the interaction between mind and body. We're used to thinking, Descartes raised this question, how do mind and body interact? And he said, maybe the mind is totally distinct from and outside the body. Nobody believes that these days, but actually if you go into a virtual world, it's rather surprisingly quite a lot like that. In a virtual world, you've got an avatar, which is doing the acting and the behaving. If you cut the avatar up, you won't find a mind. Inside there, usually you won't even find a brain. Rather, all this is controlled by a user who lives in some totally different space. The mind and the body are distinct. So you might see virtual worlds as providing a kind of vindication for Cartesian dualism.
I guess at first glance at this, it's hard to quite understand how the avatar could have its own consciousness rather than, say, some kind of extension of the consciousness of the person in the world.
Yeah. Now, there's actually two quite different cases which I kind of ran together there. One case is where a biological being enters a virtual world, as we do when we just inhabit a virtual reality video game, say now. In that case, then yeah, there's just one conscious being. It's the original person who now has an avatar. But then relative to the virtual world, there's still, the mind is outside the virtual world. The mind is here in my brain, outside the virtual world. The other case is the case where the whole thing is simulated. And then, so that's what I call a biosim, a biological creature connected to a simulation. The other case is a pure sim. This is the case where the whole world is simulated, including the person. And yeah, any conscious people in this world are themselves actually simulated creatures. So in the Matrix, Neo is a biosim. He's like got a brain and a body and a pod connected to the simulation. Whereas Agent Smith is a pure sim. He's actually a simulated creature. And yeah, I guess I started with the case of the pure sim and talking about can simulations be conscious, and then I switched to the biosim.
Okay. All right, so that presupposes then that we don't have to be embodied to be conscious. Consciousness can somehow exist in this simulated realm. And then it raises the question, when we say the word simulation, what actually are we saying there? How do we define simulation?
I guess I think of a simulation as a computer simulation, a computer-generated reality that is actually designed by a simulator. There has to be a simulator who put all this into place, and has to be computer-generated. Those are the two major things. I mean, a virtual world I usually define as a virtual reality I define as an immersive, interactive, computer-generated reality. It's immersive, you experience it all around you. It's interactive, you can interact with this reality. It's all generated by a computer. I guess a simulated reality is all that, and plus we just add in to make it explicit. It's actually designed, programmed by a simulator.
Okay, and so now that's an interesting question because, you know, who gets to be the simulator and how does that affect the world experienced by those who are simulations?
Yeah, well, we actually, you know, we can build our own virtual worlds, and then we are the simulators of those worlds. And in a way, we are the gods of those worlds. We create those worlds. We're potentially all-powerful with regard to those worlds. We can know exactly what's going on. These are some of the properties of a traditional god. So we're kind of godlike with respect to these virtual worlds. And likewise, when we think about the hypothesis that we are right now in a virtual world, that does raise the possibility that if we're in a simulation, yeah, whoever created the simulation is in effect the god of this world. Created us all-knowing, all-powerful, maybe not all good or all-wise. Might just be a hacker in the next universe up. But at least sometimes people talk about a demiurge, like a demigod. You know, there's like a god of the whole cosmos, but then we've got a local god who created this local universe. Maybe if we're in a simulation, the simulator is our demiurge.
Dave, thanks so much for coming along again. It's always fun to chat with you and good to see you, and best of luck with the book, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, great to catch up.
Cheers.
A lover of altercation, a master of obfuscation. The points made use his stock in trade, examples and funny narrations. Credit must go to Dan Dennett to realize that what the brain did was edit. He was prior to prediction and added retrodiction, but there were many who just didn't get it. The point of his user illusion is phenomena are in continuous diffusion. Multiple drafts are not just in the past, thus at no point can be drawn as conclusion. The phenomena show this disparity, suggests there must be non-temporality. The continuous flow of all that we know is an ongoing singularity. The mental's illusory inherence that determines our world of appearance should indeed be applied to the contents of mind, but not to the one having the experience. Thus a theme from the works of Dan Dennett, which will have struck you if ever you've read it, is he drew the conclusion that the mind's an illusion, losing sight of his foundational tenet. To wit, if the self's an illusion, then there's no subject to have this delusion. If the I is not there to be ensnared, then he's undermined his conclusion. It's a trap that I've labeled Cartesian, as it was René Descartes, the Parisian, who said to doubt you exist comes with a twist, because to doubt needs a thinker with reason. There's also a bit of tautology in an utterly physicalist ontology. If you think what exists is only the physics, then of course the mind will be dodgy. To wit, my last verse, to wit, qualia are not found in the brain, nor figment, nor affect, nor pain. Sure enough, only physical stuff, thus consciousness cannot obtain. Thank you.
Let's do it! Let's do it! Limits bound just everywhere, Tucson not accepted. Just 1 minute, maybe 2 to get a poem accepted. Not the old days anymore when poems rule okay. Cannot do that anymore. Be quick and have your say.
This one now must be quick. Fly it like a plane. Lots of movement, lots of wind, totally insane. Gabble fast, slur the words, make the punters have it. Machine gun speed, spit the verbs, breed them like a rabbit.
Trying hard to slow it down like a World War Panzer. Got a plan, make it work, so a change in stanza. There once was a fellow called God, who said it's exceedingly odd that people can stare, yet not see me there. Give Bishop Berkeley the nod.
Bishop Berkeley exclaimed it's okay. With humans it's always that way. When they're not there to see Newton's green leafy tree, they claim it's there, so they say.
Penrose would say that's not right. We must save these folk from their plight. The right answer perhaps is, when the waveform collapses, consciousness then sees the light.
That's only apparently so, said Hammeroff. Here, I'm the pro. The answer's quite clear. Perhaps I should steer you to Tubalin. There you can go.
Chalmers smiles and breaks into beams. It's all just linguistical memes. Nothing explains, despite all the claims, how chemistry turns into dreams.
The thing about Chalmers' theorem is that whether you read him or hear him, it all seems a fix to believe the Matrix is all, and I'm just a sim.
And whilst we're on about tricks, the thing that has me transfixed is the whole damn shebang with a nuclear clang has been hijacked by quantum mechanics. 1, 2, 3, 4, so to shift the stanza back, have a laugh and never lack a sense of fun that comes from rhyme. Pay no heed to that illusion of time. Let it go and damn the truth.
All that matters is that youth
and elderly experience
satisfy your inner sense
of who you are and what you mean inside God's enormous dream.
My name is Megumi. It's nice to meet everyone. It's also my first time here at the conference. I don't have anything prepared, so I'm just gonna try to wing it. Can we use philosophy to shed light on technology? There's so much we don't know. I'm excited to see where we all go. So how do we know if this isn't a generated world? Does it matter? Are we in a simulation? Are we really here? Does it even matter when you're right here with me in this reality? Here we are. If this is a simulation, I'm glad to be here with you. I hope I come back and have this dream again right here. Thank you. That's all I have.
We've got time between the Rutherfords and Megumi. Give it up!
I gotta tell
you the story of the Zombie Blues. 1999 at the in a consciousness conference in Northern Arizona University. Chalmers, Pradeep Mahalik, and myself were at a blues bar, drinking beer on the porch with a blues band playing in the background George Thorogood's Bad to the Bone. And we started talking about zombies and how zombies, which Dave had invented in the philosophical sense, were people who looked and acted like us, but didn't really have any inner conscious experience. They were zombies. They couldn't feel anything. Nothing. Empty inside. And so they would have a right to feel the blues, but they couldn't feel the blues. They couldn't feel anything. And so, could a zombie have the blues? Was what we started talking about as we were drinking beer. And so at the next conference after the poetry slam, we did the zombie blues. And Dave did the first verse, and he's going to start the first verse tonight. And we have a few other people who are going to sing a few verses while the band backs them up and makes it sound reasonably good. And anybody else who wants to do that can line up in these chairs and get in line to sing the zombie blues. Yes. So, without further ado, let's welcome the philosopher king, David Chalmers.
All right, thank you, Stu. Greetings, Tucson. Woo! We have had enough. We have had enough of the joys of the conscious. Right. It is time for the terrors of the unconscious. Yes. It is the night of the zombies. All comers are welcome as we sing the zombie blues. I act like you act. I do what you do. But I don't know what it's like to be you. What consciousness is, I ain't got a clue. I got the zombie blues.
I see like you see, I smell as you smell, but I don't feel heaven, but I don't feel hell. What consciousness is, I don't have a clue. But I got the zombie, the zombie, the zombie, the zombie.
So that brings us to the end of our 2022 series of Consciousness Central, coming from the Science of Consciousness Conference here in Tucson, Arizona. I hope you've enjoyed our offerings. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone behind the scenes who's helped to make these programs possible, including our very own production wizard, Jason Canfield, our European associate over in Stuttgart, Sasha Seifert of Muna. Thanks as always to TSC co-chairs Stuart Hammeroff and George Mashaw. Also to Conference Assistant Director, the one and only Abby Behar Montefiore. A special thank you goes out to Eugene Zhang of the Eugene Zhang Family Foundation for his generous support of this production. And finally, thanks to each and every one of you, our audience around the globe, for your continued support over the years. Next year, if the consciousness gods are willing, TSC will be held in Taormina in beautiful Sicily, hosted by our good friend Riccardo Manzotti at IULM in Milan. And while nothing is certain in these challenging times, we set our intention to be there for another round of Consciousness Central. Until then, this is Nick Day saying stay conscious and goodbye for now.